reason, because I'm not a historian. So talking to you about historical questions is a little tricky. I'm also not an engineer, so I have a kind of feeling I'm the shill on the platform here on my hand side. I do have perhaps a slightly embarrassing confession to make, that I teach a course that's called The History of Information, which in 15 weeks trots from Lascaux to Twitter. The claims that I would put around that are not very strong. I was just looking at my evaluations for last semester, and one of them I said, what did you not like about this course called The History of Information? It was a one-word answer, history. So I've not done a very good job of representing you to other parts of the world. Let me, if I may, looking at the broad question, again, make pretty much the same set that Dan made. So, well, the question says, is Google good for history? To talk mostly about Google Books. The sort of shift in a way that I think of as going from those famous scribble, 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 Mr. Gibbon, to scan, 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 Mr. Google. The two reasons for doing this. One is because I think that was the premise of the panel, and maybe three. Two, because I've sounded off on the topic. And maybe a third is because I've been absolutely splendidly vilified by historians for doing so. So let me see if I can get back up even further in my bloodism, as it seems to be thought. But my answer, in fact, is exactly the same as Dan's. Is Google Books good for history? Yeah, absolutely. My question is it good enough? And my answer is no. Somewhat similar to Dan's in the tone of the answer, but I think I look at different points, some of which I think he wanted to dismiss and say are not important. So let me try and outline just three issues around this. I'll go through three. I want to try and say what I think is wrong with it as it's manifest at the moment, why I think it went wrong, and therefore will be harder to fix than we might imagine. And then finally, the point of why it seems to me it's sometimes surprisingly hard to criticize Google. So that, I suppose, is a different take. I mean, Dan seems to think that Google is an easy target to criticize and everybody's taking shots at it. I actually tend to think the other side, that people tend to think too highly of Google, and it's worth taking shots at it. And that way I would remember Microsoft, who deserved a lot of criticism, and it was a good thing to do. And I think we must criticize. I think that probably the people that I am most at odds with, and this again puts me at odds with the one remaining neutral on the platform, are actually librarians. I think librarians, I just see a fight on every side. Librarians, it seems to me, have been, in general, and I'm going to make some exceptions, remarkably supine with regard to Google. And they're the people, I think, who could have held Google's feet to the fire, and I think they failed to do so. So in a way, there's a sort of story which I haven't found the punchline for. It's one of those, an Englishman, an Irishman, and Scotsman went into a bar, and this is kind of an engineer, a librarian, and a scholar, embarked on this project. Who won? What's the punchline? I'm still trying to see. Let me try and say first what I think is wrong. I think that, and I'll just explain this a little later, but I think of, and I really like to think this way in working in Silicon Valley, as a resource and constraint issue. I'll amplify that later, but what I want to say is that we look in some ways as books as these paper-bound collections of information. And if we can come along and extract the information and leave the paper behind, that will make life a lot easier. And in many ways it does. But I think it overlooks the fact that books are actually, I made the point again, enormously obdurate, complex, and annoying things. But they are that way in part because they embody physically a resolution to a lot of very complex questions about human communication. They may not do it perfectly, and that often get in the way, but a lot of the difficulties we have in communicating, in fact, can resolve in the physicality of the book. So when you take that away, you have to think a lot about what you're losing as well as what you're gaining. Now, my argument would be, and one reason that Google is fraught with problems, I think, Google Books, is because, in the line, the metadata is bad. Dan thinks it's not such a big problem. I tend to think that it is a very large problem. Because my feeling is that when you take away those almost invisible resources in the book as the way it was built, you actually have to provide yet better metadata to help resolve the remaining information that you have. Information doesn't speak for itself in its own validity. If you write a check to somebody and they look quizzically at it as if to say, should I trust it or not, it doesn't actually help to lean forward and write good for payment on the front of the check. That isn't going to get someone to rush off immediately and say, okay, well that makes it okay, it's a little more information. So my general theory is that you have in some ways to think a lot about the ways in which you triangulate data, the way in which it has been triangulated in the past. And I think that Google in many ways has made a hash of that because they didn't understand the problem. Now let me say again, you have to say, you always have to say this, because I use Google and Google Books extensively. In fact, I just finished a piece on the contribution of the Union label to innovation and trademarks in the United States. Weird topic. Google Books was fantastic in many, many ways for lots of ways that I was able to make that argument. Things I would not have known existed, things I could not have said. I rely on it enormously, but I was also at the same time using something like the Redex database, infuriating though it is. I was using 18th century books online, early English books online, and many of you may have read Bill Sherman's wonderful piece on the inadequacies of that. But the difference is quite extraordinary. And the point is not to say simply, and I agree with Dan on this entirely, wouldn't it be wonderful if they had managed to scan to the extent that Google does? But on the other side, wouldn't it be wonderful if Google had managed in some way to arrange some kind of metadata in the way that they have? And that's what I like the two to come together. The question of metadata, I'm going to pass over fairly quickly, but point you all to a paper that my colleague wrote for the Chronicle of Higher Education, Jeffrey Nunn, about Google as a metadata train wreck. There he pulled up just series after series after series of things that Google had got wrong. Now what's interesting is that, I'll mention this again later, he got vilified for that, not so much by historians, very much by librarians. The people who thanked him for it were actually people Dan has mentioned, both Dan Clancy and John Allwent of Google, thanked Jeff for pointing to the fact that they had these millions of metadata errors in their database. So they took it seriously. What are the things you got wrong? Well, masses of misidentification by title, I'll refer to one of those later. Masses of misidentification by author, with Henry James writing Madame Bovary. Masses of misidentification by classification, Thomas Brown's urn burial classified under gardening. And masses of misidentification by date. So that I was delighted to find that I had written a book published in 1879. You may wonder how I remain looking so young. That last point, of course, it seems to me, is critical for historians. What do historians have going for them if it isn't dates? And if you mess up dates, you guys, you haven't got a lot left. Okay, so, is it surprising that they went down this road? Well, no, I don't think so. I remember Hal Varian talking to me in 2004 and saying, we're going to scan books. And I said, well, which ones are you going to scan? Oh, he said, we'll just scan every one of them. That will resolve all the problems of selection. That's probably not a very good way to begin. And I think that Google themselves, talking to people at Google, and I've not met Brandon before, but talking to other people who work on Google Books, my sense is, though they'll never say it publicly, that they took on a lot more than they realized that they were taking on. Another thing that I discovered, and I had this both denied and confirmed by Google, that I talked to a lot of the early libraries, the first 6 libraries that were working with Google. When Google came to them, they asked for the books, and they were offered metadata. And Google said, we don't need metadata. That's library stuff. We can do it with algorithms. Well, in fact, they tiptoed back a little later, as Dan Clancy pushed Will admit, and said, actually, that stuff called metadata. Wouldn't mind if we had a little of that, and took it away with them. To do away with metadata, you need, as Dan has suggested, very good algorithms. I suspect that's not enough, but you need very good algorithms, and Google has a bunch of those because people like Brandon are enormously intelligent people. But you also need to understand the problem. And my hunch is that Google didn't understand the problem. Because that, in a way, is what scholars do. And if you push Dan Clancy to the wall, he'll say, yeah, well, we don't really understand that stuff. And you want to say, well, why didn't you talk to scholars? And one reason, I think, is that librarians stood as a kind of proxy in between the two, and that wasn't very helpful. So what is the issue, in a way? I think this is it. What we have got out of Google